we've still been watching this nightmare. Like, I mean, so I'm just curious how that unfolded, because obviously you were aware long before October 7th.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I was in a relatively comfortable part of the UN. I spent all of those more than 3 decades in the UN Human Rights Program, right? So that's the part of the House that, in fact, has performed pretty well during the genocide and during the recent atrocities that we've been witnessing more broadly. Because that's where you find things like the independent human rights rapporteurs like Francesca Albanese, the commissions of inquiry like that, which found genocide in Palestine, the International Court of Justice, the humanitarian actors, and others. That side of the UN has performed as it was intended to perform, and has performed quite well. Not least of all, the hundreds of UNRWA staff who have been murdered by the Israeli regime just in the last couple of years, just for doing their jobs, and yet the survivors of which have continued to serve their neighbors throughout the horrors of the genocide in Gaza. That's a part of the UN in which I was always very comfortable. There's another part of the UN, of course, which is the political side of the House, represented by the Secretary General, by the senior political officials of the organization, by the Security Council. I mean, those in particular, which have failed miserably to meet their obligations under the UN Charter to prevent and to respond to mass atrocities like genocide and crimes like aggression. Some of that by design. The Security Council was designed by the winners of World War II to not be able to act when one of the permanent members, like the United States, doesn't want it to be able to act effectively. And some of it by abdication, like the Secretary General, who simply has not had the courage and principle that is necessary to stand up to powers like the US, like the Israeli regime, like the Germans and others, and do what it is they're expected to do in a moment of crisis like that. The tension between those two very much defined my decades in the United Nations. There was a lot of struggle around those sorts of issues. But over a period, I mean, you wanted to see how things evolved, over a period of decades, and you can mark the starting point really with the beginning of the so-called Oslo process.
Okay.
You saw the UN more and more abandon its mandated normative responsibilities, abandon the human rights instruments, abandon international humanitarian law, abandon the UN Charter in large measure, in favor of a notion of political expediency that said you defer to power. If the Americans or the Brits or the Germans push back, or increasingly so in the UN, the Israel lobby, you back off. And that is no way to defend human rights. It's no way to defend peace and security. It's no way to defend the UN Charter. And I found myself in the midst of several storms over the years of that, because, when the Oslo process started, I mean, if you go before that, the UN has plenty of sins in its background, including the original sin of ignoring the wishes of the indigenous people of Palestine when they tried to force partition in 1947 and 1948, of excusing the Nakba, the first genocidal assault on the Palestinian people in 47 and 48, ratifying their ethnic cleansing and so on. But when the UN began to change in the 1960s and 70s, when more and more countries from the global south that were decolonized became member states of the UN, you saw a dramatic change in the political positioning of the organization, such that decolonization, self-determination, the struggle against apartheid, the struggle against colonialism, and the struggle against Israeli political Zionism, reached a peak in which the organization was really being true to its norms and standards. Well, that all turned around with the arrival of the unipolar moment. And, and a couple of years later with the launch of the so-called Oslo process that served as a kind of a diplomatic smokescreen, behind which you saw expedited persecution of the Palestinians, expedited confiscation of their land, expedited settlement activity, an increase in mass incarceration, torture, all of the horrors with which we are now very familiar, and moves within the organization to say, don't push on these human rights issues. You can't do anything to upset the peace process that never was. It was never a peace process. It was always a diplomatic smokescreen. It has been absolutely catastrophic, not just for the Palestinian people, but more broadly for the UN and the quest for human rights and peace in the world. And if you were on the side of that was pushing the normative agenda of the UN, you caught a lot of flack within the UN. For me, that peaked with the expediting of the genocide in October of 2023, where the hammer came down on me quite forcefully and ultimately led to my decision to write that letter that you mentioned, Jen, and to do the kind of work that I'm doing now and trying to shine a light on what's going wrong there.
I mean, you've been doing this for a really long time though, like this kind of work. And I was also curious what it was like for you. I mean, you lived in Gaza at one point, I believe back in the 90s. Is that right? Was that when you were back there? Okay. So in what capacity were you there? Like, what was that like for you? And what was your experience there? I mean, I'm sure it had to be very profound in many ways.
Yeah. Well, I've been in the international human rights movement for about 45 years now. And so even before I joined the UN, I had done a human rights mission during the first Intifada in the 1980s to Palestine, where I spent, a period of time directly witnessing the kinds of systematic human rights abuses that are just a part of Palestinian life under occupation. And so I knew the place quite well. It's a paradoxical. I told the story before that of all of the posts that I've put up on X or on social media generally, the one that got the most vociferous, angry, and hateful reactions was the one where I described the beauty of society in Gaza, because it was so contrary to the narrative of trying to paint an entire people as being some sort of barbarians who deserve genocide, that when I spoke about the warmth and the sophistication and the humor and the education and the beauty and depth of the culture there, that really ticked off those who were in the sort of pro-genocide camp. But that was my experience, despite all of the horrors that Palestinians have been subjected to for 80 years, just by virtue of being born Palestinian in Palestine. That society is a rich, rooted, and beautiful society. And we see even throughout this genocide now, we see manifestations of that all the time. But when I returned after that mission, a couple of years later, I joined the United Nations, and then I was tapped to be the senior human rights advisor in Palestine in the mid-1990s, in the beginning of the Oslo process itself. So early, in the Oslo process. And there, we saw the same sorts of realities, the same domination, the same subordination, the same persecution, but with this kind of added layer, what I called already a smokescreen, but this kind of added layer, this curtain that told us that you cannot now, poke at the foundations of this unjust reality there. And so, on the one hand, a wonderful experience. On the other hand, a horrifying experience to see the brutality, to hear the laughter of soldiers from Brooklyn as they beat up on elderly persons in the West Bank, because the dehumanization of the indigenous people, of the Palestinians, has been so complete and so systematic over so many decades that that's the kind of cruelty that you see. And I've always said that this kind of genocide that is ongoing now as we speak, which has not stopped during the so-called ceasefire, during which hundreds of Palestinians were murdered, during which food and medicine continued to be blocked, during which more Palestinians continued to be seized, during which mass incarceration and torture and sexual abuse has continued. So there has been no break in the genocide, no real ceasefire as well. But that this kind of genocide was always inevitable. Mm-hmm. This is an Israeli project that was born in genocide, and it is an Israeli project that is by definition genocidal, unless the plan is to colonize the moon. Colonization of this form, settler colonialism that requires the eviction, replacement, and erasure of the indigenous people, is by definition a genocidal enterprise. That's exactly what we've been witnessing. And what should the UN have been doing in this case? They should have been pulling out all the stops, mobilizing every mechanism, any power that it has, diplomatic, political, even military, through some mechanisms that would have allowed the deployment of a protection force. And instead, what they have done is in some cases been sitting on their hands, in other cases, tapped up against the wall of complicity. And again, let me say, with the exception of courageous people like I mentioned Francesca Albanese, the special rapporteur, who is officially sanctioned by the United States government simply for speaking the truth about Israeli atrocities. The same thing with the ICC judges and prosecutors, a number of human rights NGOs that are subjected to the same kinds of sanctions. But that part of the UN has been great, but the political side of the House, shameless and shameful.
Yeah.
Greg, we've covered Francesca multiple times, and obviously your story, goes without saying, is pretty significant. But the thing that we've noticed, which is probably the most disturbing, as I'm sure you've observed, is that there are far too many pacifists in these moments. I don't want to say they're all Neville Chamberlains, but it seems that for too many circumstances, especially when Francesca is basically being held out to dry, which so many people have just readily been willing to go along with, I find that to be deeply disturbing, and it takes away the full credibility of the UN in so many respects. Like, at some point, you have to make a stand. You have to realize what's happening. And now that we're basically in the midst of a world war, you really have to wonder that if something was done a little bit more drastic on the UN's part a year ago, let's say, that the landscape would look a lot different right now. What do you think about that?
I mean, that's absolutely right. And it's not just the UN. The whole world has decided in favor of appeasement, of a historically unprecedented in the post-war years, aggressive entity in the Israeli regime. This is a country that has carried out serial aggression on virtually all of its neighbors, has attacked 7 countries in the last 2 years, is carrying out a genocide, is on trial for genocide in the International Court of Justice. Its leaders are indicted for crimes against humanity by the International Criminal Court. It carried out a transnational terror attack with booby trap pagers in Lebanon. It occupies the territory of 3 nations: the Palestinians, the Lebanese, and the Syrians. It has carried out assassinations all across the region, has attacked humanitarian ships in the Mediterranean, and that's for the rest of the world, which has continued either to with appeasement or direct complicity in the case, especially of the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and a few other states. That's with regard to the broader world. With regard to the UN, again, unprecedented. There has never been a country in the history of the UN that has perpetrated the kinds of acts against the UN that the Israeli regime has done. It violated more UN resolutions than any country in history by a wide margin. It has attacked UN warehouses and food stores and installations and offices and convoys, physically attacked them. It has arrested countless, over the years, thousands of UN staff. It has incarcerated and tortured UN staff. It has murdered 370 UN staff in just the last 2 years. It has declared that the Secretary General is persona non grata in Israel and even in the occupied territories over which they have no authority whatsoever. It has slandered UN agencies. It has waged campaigns that have resulted in the hobbling of UN agencies. And its ambassador stood up in front of the General Assembly with a mini shredder and literally shredded the UN Charter, as they have been doing figuratively year after year after year. And yet, the Israeli regime still has UN credentials. It walks freely in the hallways, bumping into the colleagues, the families and colleagues of which they have murdered, and interfering with UN operations everywhere that it is present. And what has the UN done? It has tried to be diplomatic, tried to be non-confrontational. The Secretary General has tried to both sides genocide. Can you imagine, right? To both sides aggression. The entire international legal order, built up brick by brick, nascent, incomplete, sometimes very ineffective, but built up brick by brick since the Second World War, is being dismantled in the name of a single oppressive regime, the Israeli regime. And in that international legal order, the 2 highest rules, the 2 preeminent rules of international law are: there shall not be genocide, and there shall not be aggression. And now you've got a country which is openly perpetrating what has always been called the first live stream genocide, cliche but true, and serial aggression all around the region. And yet it's still a full member state of the UN with full privileges, even as it works to dismantle and destroy it. By the way, together, hand in glove with the United States government.